Well, I'm a pastor of a church here as well, and one of the main questions we often hear is, well, what's the difference between a Jew and a Gentile? Because in the Bible, it's very clear that there is a distinction between Jew and Gentile. Even in the Messianic age, there's a clear distinction between Israel and Jesus and the 12 apostles and the resurrected King David ruling and reigning over Israel, and the church ruling and reigning over the world. So for our viewers today, what is the main difference between a Jew and a Gentile?
So in the ancient world, when God revealed himself to Abram and then his offspring, the people of the world were by and large worshiping idols. You didn't have, what we call the three monotheistic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You didn't have more than 2 billion people worshiping the God of Israel through Jesus. You had idolaters. You had people that worshiped gods of wood and stone. So the one true God revealed himself to Abraham and then his descendants. And then he called those people to be his own so they could be a priestly nation, so they could be a light to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And he gave them his laws and commandments to teach them his ways and to keep them separate from the nations. So Paul in Romans 3:1, after saying that true Jewish spirituality is inward, not outward, circumcision of the heart, not the flesh. He then says in Romans 3:1, well, then what's the advantage of being a Jew? He says, well, much in every way, because the oracles of God were committed to them.
Yes.
So only the Jewish people in the ancient world had God's words. They had the prophets speaking God's words. They had words of wisdom from the Lord and from his people. They had his Torah, his teaching, his law, uniquely out of all peoples on the planet. So it was very important to be a Jew. It was a special privilege. That's why God judged our people much more severely and punished us for our sins. And it was through the Jewish people that Messiah came to the world. Now, today, when you have different monotheistic faiths, all claiming to rightly worship the one true God, it's certainly different. But the Jewish claim to this moment would be that the Jewish people not only uniquely have God's Torah, but they have oral traditions that have been passed on from Moses and to this day, and that they continue to keep those so that, in a sense, they would say they alone have the full revelation of God.
Okay. And so by these oral traditions, are you talking about the Mishnah?
Well, yeah, the Mishnah, Talmud, everything that follows. In other words, yeah. So the Herbert Danby translation, that would just be one foundational but tiny part of the oral law. The concept is that on Mount Sinai, God revealed to Moses the interpretation of the law. For example, where it says, don't murder. Okay, you understand what that is and explains in other places. And there's a difference between murder and, say, killing in battle. But it says, don't work on the Sabbath. If you work on the Sabbath, you'll be put to death. But then it never defines work. So a traditional Jew would say, how could it be that important? And God doesn't define it. He must have defined it elsewhere. So the understanding is that God gave the interpretation of what it means to work on Mount Sinai. He explained that to Moses when he was with him for 40 days. And he gave him keys to interpreting the Torah for every generation. So now, next generation, they come to rulings, they come to decisions, they get passed on, just like the courts in UK and America. They come to decisions on things, and then those become binding for next generations. So it's constantly developing and evolving. The Torah was given over 3,300, 3,400 years ago in a different part of the world, different culture. Well, what about today? How do you apply things today? What about with modern technology and things like that? So it continues to develop, but instead of just being passed on orally, a couple hundred years after the time of Jesus, the rabbinic concept was that there was so much material that had been passed on through the generations that the Jewish people were under persecution and scattered, that they now had to write these things down and then build on it. So that's the traditional Jewish view. If you talk to a religious Jewish man and say, where did you get the idea to put on the phylacteries, the tefillin, so the prayer box on your forehead and on your arm, where did you get that idea? Because it's not exactly clear in Deuteronomy and elsewhere what it's talking about. Is that metaphorical or literal?
Yeah.
He would say, oh, no. God gave us the details on Mount Sinai. I learned it from my father, who learned it from his father, who learned it from his father, all the way back to Moses. And then they would challenge you, how do you understand what it is? And so for me, as a new believer in Jesus, quoting from the King James Bible, where I'd memorized thousands of verses, talking to these rabbis who've been studying Hebrew since they've been little children, they're looking at me like, who are you to teach us? You can't even read Hebrew. So these are some of the challenges that have to be overcome. That being said, your average Jew today is not Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox. That community continues to grow in number because of high birth rates. But your average Jew, say in America, UK, is not that religious. Your average Christian probably knows the Bible better than your average Jew.
Okay, is that why you studied Hebrew in the first place? Was because they told you didn't know what you were talking about?
Yeah, here I am quoting a verse, and these really nice rabbis, ultra-Orthodox, long beard, very sincere, very passionate about God, not like the synagogue I grew up in, sounding very spiritual like the people I went to church with. And I quote a verse, they go, oh, those English translations, they're so here. And they'll take out the Hebrew Bible, they say, look, we're not lying here. And they're going letter by letter. I feel like a little child. Well, I want to know what it says. I want to be able to read it. Am I being misled? Are these Christian Bibles faulty? Are the interpretations bogus? I had to learn for myself.
And are they bogus?
No.
No, good.
However,
yeah,
there are serious questions that need serious answers. And many times, see, this was my problem. When I went to the Christian books to get answers to Jewish objections, I didn't find them. Either they were not addressed, or they were not addressed in a way that showed any sensitivity to the Jewish perspective.
Okay.
When I went to talk to Jews for Jesus and other groups like that did a lot of evangelism, that's what they were good at, evangelism, but they didn't focus on apologetics.
Okay.
So that's why I wrote 5 volumes of answering Jewish objections to Jesus, because it didn't exist. And nothing like that had been done, especially by a Jewish believer, in generations.
Okay.
So it was important to do that, to be able to have something to present, so that, just like C.S. Lewis, he became intellectually convinced of theism, went from atheism to theism, and then he had an encounter with the Lord.
Yeah.
So many times, apologetics serves as pre-evangelism. It gets the person to the point where they're willing to listen because you've answered the questions. Now they're willing to open their heart to the rest of the message.
Yeah, yeah.